Okay, so again, welcome to the lunchtime webinar series. I'm delighted to welcome the presenter for this talk, which is Professor Niall Mac Dowell from Imperial College in London. He's a professor of energy systems engineering. He's done plenty of work on CCS, which you'll recognize from his publication list. But is generally interested in transitions to low carbon economies. He's also the principal investigator for one of our consortium research projects. So that consortium research project is the subject of the talk today, and it's called a comparative assessment and regional specific optimization for GGR. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Niall, if that's okay.
Thank you, Phil. I'll just go back to sharing my screen. Hopefully that works. Okay. So thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to come along, and thank you, Phil, for inviting me. I've abbreviated the title to Region-Specific Optimization of Greenhouse Gas Removals. You can see here alongside myself, this is, as Phil says, it's a fairly large consortium project with people from University of Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, and originally UEA, though Dabo has since moved to UCL. So quite a lot of folks in the UK, but also the Mercator Institute in Germany and IASA in Austria. So actually an international consortium at that. The sort of the underlying question that we wanted to address when we were coming up with this idea was that there's a lot of almost exclusive focus in the context of GGR on how different technology, doing techno-economic type analyses of different GGR pathways or technologies or approaches. And my question was, well, how will these different systems work together in the context of an evolving energy system and in the context of an evolving policy landscape? But also, how will different countries' abilities to actually deploy these pathways and options vary from region to region, and sort of how will all of this evolve with time? So there were quite sort of overarching questions as opposed to some of the more specific questions that I was used to dealing with in my life as a CCS researcher that Phil refers to previously, and that was the background here. Just to move on, I mean, again, and this is just sort of to tell you guys all something that you already know. So we understand that in order to get to the 1.5 or 2 degrees targets that have been agreed vis-a-vis Paris, starting to remove CO2 from the atmosphere really quite soon. Hopefully you can see my cursor, and likely starting to do this from the next decade, from the 2030s onwards. This is going to be really important. In the UK context, and this is a graphic taken from the relatively recent Royal Society and Royal Academy of Engineering report, in the UK context, it's a combination of, let's say, direct offsets, so dealing with the emissions from aviation and shipping, non-CO2 and industry emissions that are difficult to abate, and then what you might consider mopping up of fugitive emissions from, say, heat and power. So we would expect to see a lot of direct abatement in those sectors, but perhaps not 100% abatement, and therefore we would need to do some mopping up. So that implies some quite distinct roles for GGR technologies and services. I think in general, and this is just sort of a conclusion that I've come to over the last number of years really, that there's a lot of conflation, not necessarily in the academic sector, but more broadly in policy and commercial and industrial sectors, around what is and is not CDR or GGR or negative emissions and so on. We had an interesting call with Phil not that long ago about this taxonomy. And so in that context, I'd offer the following from ZEP late last year, middle of last year. So greenhouse gas removal. So this involves the physical removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in a manner intended to be permanent. And so I think that that's quite important. So it's not avoided CO2, it's not displaced CO2, it's the actual removal and in a manner intended to be permanent. It's important then to recognize that avoided CO2, so taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and then converting that into a product, e.g. a fuel, and then combusting that fuel and then re-releasing that CO2 to the atmosphere. That's not GGR. And I'm probably telling you guys all things that you know, but it's amazing to me how frequently these taxonomy confusions come up in discussion. And so I think that's a useful place to start. The other piece then is the definition of permanent. So what does permanent mean in the context of greenhouse gas removal? So here I was able to take some of Stuart Hazeldene's work, and he had in turn borrowed it from an older resource, where you can look at what happens when you inject a pulse of CO2 into the atmosphere. This is obviously a model. And then think about how long it takes for that CO2 to re-equilibrate, to reabsorb into the Earth system. And what's useful to kind of recognize here is that A, it's an exponential decay, but B, this x-axis is in tens of thousands of years. And okay, what's happening out here in the sort of 20,000 year period plus is probably not all that interesting to us, but it's a long time. So weeks, months, decades, even low numbers of centuries may not be enough to get us to a place of permanence. And so you can sort of see that you're probably on in at least the millennia timescale, perhaps 10 millennia, before that anthropogenic pulse of CO2 into the atmosphere has been reabsorbed or reabsorbed back into this Earth system. And so that then starts to have some pretty, I think, profound implications in terms of how one might go about writing contracts for delivering greenhouse gas removal services. And I think that this is particularly pertinent at the moment, given all of the sort of enthusiasm and emphasis around voluntary, scaling up voluntary carbon markets and so on, and what's actually on offer in those arenas. So one of the first things that we did was we took, well, this is some actual research that we managed to do in the course of the research project. We looked at what is proposed to be done by the various integrated assessment models. So this was sort of a pretty broad brush. We then tried to think about different ways in which, so at a European level, we know that X amount of greenhouse gas removals will need to happen by a given date and so on. And then the question is, how might those GGR burdens be reasonably shared between different EU member states? And you can see sort of a number of different measures of thinking about how that might be shared. And the key thing is that, I mean, A, this is not meant to be prescriptive. These are sort of ideas and suggestions about how these things might be sliced. They do, however, draw on the ways in which the EU distributes, for example, renewable capacity deployment targets and so on. So there's some relation to reality. And the key thing is that depending on how you do that, the GGR burden that different regions might get, so in this case, we're looking at Brazil, China, India, the USA, and the EU 28, depending on the approach that you take to this sharing, this really changes the distribution of burden and responsibility around the world. And so, for example, you might think that, well, one way could be, historical emissions since 1850. Is that a reasonable way to think about responsibility? Or should it be, something a little bit more recent, since people started seriously thinking about CO2 in the atmosphere being a public harm or public damage? So how this happens, I think, is going to be really interesting and really important. Breaking this down into a European perspective, again, we thought about responsibility since 1960. Again, this is sort of basically since world leaders Lyndon Johnson, Thatcher, and so on started worrying about the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Capacity, so this is ability to pay effectively, and then needs, so the population-weighted distribution. And again, you can see that the way in which this responsibility might be apportioned, really quite varies. So again, not sort of offering this as a prescription, but rather saying that the way in which these targets are ultimately arrived at, and again, there's a lot of discussion in both British and European contexts at the moment about about target-based approaches for GGR deployment. How that actually gets spread out will be quite important. So What's really important then is we started to look at the kind of the biogeophysical endowments of different regions around the world and their ability to actually deploy these different pathways. And one of the things that we found was that regional targets, they don't necessarily coincide with these constraints. It's also worth thinking about, where we have existing port facilities to move different resources around the world, particularly biomass, for example. We might want to ship that to a lot of different places, and also then the extent of existing knowledge around adequately proved CO2 storage resources. So there's some evidence to suggest that pretty much wherever we look, we'll find it. But on the other hand, the extent to which those resources have been proved out to date, it's quite heterogeneous around the world, and it's really a key bottleneck to moving this forward. What we then did was look at how this might work at an EU level. You're looking at now the quotas and potentials in terms of gigatons of CO2 over the century, the various EU member states, and then the color corresponds to the different sources of biomass that we were able to find, so energy crops that you might be able to develop, or ag and forestry residues that might be available, and then different types of storage potential, so coal fields, deep saline aquifers, hydrocarbon fields, and so on. And then we can look at the quotas, these circles, squares, and triangles, relative to targets. And what's really interesting is that in many countries, it is almost impossible for these, well, it seems to be impossible for these countries to meet any of their quotas according to the way we've sort of shared them out. So what this starts to take you toward is a place where collaboration between countries in a really active and meaningful way will be really, really important if we are to meet these goals in an affordable and socially and so on benign way. And I think that again, we're having lots of conversations at the moment about collaborations around vaccine distribution and so on. And I think that when we come to this, it may also become quite challenging. So this is something that is really worth thinking about. And countries that have strong storage potential might play one role. Countries with potentially strong biomass potential may well play a different role. This is obviously thinking primarily around geosequestration and bioenergy type pathways, so BECCS and so on. But the point stands, and also there's more on this in the context of afforestation and so on. One of the tools that we've developed as part of this project and have used pretty extensively is we call it the Monet framework. Monet, mostly because it's a French painter who I quite like, and also the student Mathilde, well, she's no longer a student, Mathilde Fajardi, who developed the tool, is also French, so it seemed appropriate. It's reasonably global insofar as it describes the US, Brazil, EU 28, India, and China. Reasons we picked those countries or regions. It gives us a good east-west and north-south description of the world. Incorporates quite a lot of different types of economies and also quite important economies. So it gives us a good kind of picture. It reads in the potential yield of different types of energy crops and other crops, so trees and grasses and so on. Availability of what we think we know about crop residue, availability of different types of land, marginal land and other types of land cover, and also what is reasonably well known about CO2 storage capacity. So those are sort of the initial conditions of the model. We then run it in a sort of a decadal time step toward 2100. So it's an optimization framework, aiming to deliver CO2 removal targets that are in line with what are set out under the various IPCC P1 through P4 pathways. And as we do that, we see different rates of change of the carbon intensity of energy services, so heat, power, mobility, and so on, across these different regions. So we've got our initial conditions and then how things are likely to change. And then this can be done to, for example, minimize cost of meeting targets, minimize land use, minimize water use, maximize the CO2 efficiency or minimize CO2 leakage along all of these, or maximize energy efficiency or so on. So lots of different ways of slicing this pie. This is the lens through which we've looked at this problem primarily. Right now, the tool includes BECCS, So different types of biomass to different types of energy services, so not just electricity. It includes different flavors of direct air capture, so broadly speaking, solids and liquids. Afforestation, sorry, blanking. So afforestation, so again, range of different crops and different landscapes and so on. And biochar. So we're trying to kind of slowly build that portfolio up and try and understand how these different pathways for removing CO2 from the atmosphere might evolve. It is really tricky, as I guess everyone knows, to compare the different options. So, really can become a case of comparing apples and oranges. So afforestation, BECCS, and direct air capture, they are really quite different. So thinking about how to equitably and reason and fairly compare them can be challenged. We've identified a number of key figures of merit through this, and you can see that the spider diagrams are really quite different. So this is a challenge, and many so this is also a question that includes many different stakeholders, whether they're project proponents or different publics or policymakers and so on. So and everybody will have different perspectives on it. So it's really tricky to do this. It's not easy to do this. So one of the first things that we did was try to just ask a basic question. I mean, does BECCS work? I mean, this seems to be consistently controversial every time the topic comes up. And the answer that we came to was, maybe if you do it right, but it's equally very possible to do it pretty stupidly. So what you're seeing here on the y-axis is the cumulative emissions of a given BECCS project going out over 50 years. So this is sort of broadly speaking the length of a project, maybe. What you see at the beginning is the carbon debt that might be incurred by doing a project. So this can include different levels of induced emissions arising from land use change and so on. I forget exactly what this scenario was, but when you get into this upper bound place and so on, you're starting to kind of chop down trees to plant grasses and things like that. So you're doing some very silly things. Of course, you can do BECCS in a context where you have very limited, if any, carbon debt at the beginning, and therefore the carbon break-even time, so the point at which the carbon removed from the atmosphere equates to the amount of carbon debt that you've incurred at the beginning. That's your break-even time. And in this example, it could be as little as 5 years, or it could be as many as 35 years. So you can do these things right, and you can do these things wrong. And so there's no one size fits all. There's no one size fits all answer, which is a bit banal in some senses, but it also sort of serves to underscore the complexity that you're dealing with here. What it also tells you about is how important it will be as these projects move forward to have really good auditing. So, in our language, that might be life cycle analysis, but to have really good auditing of the entire supply chain, the upstream and downstream of these projects, and to incentivize based on the amount of carbon removed from the atmosphere, as opposed to, for example, the amount of carbon stored. Those will get you very, very different drivers and very different supply chains. Does BECCS generate power? Does it actually break even? And again, maybe. So what you're seeing on the y-axis here is the net energy balance expressed in units of electricity. Above the line is positive, below the line is negative. The amount of BECCS capacity that you would need to meet a given target, I think we chose 50 megatons per year. At the time, that was a sort of UK type number. And then the amount of water that you're needing to use. And then the size of the circle corresponds to the amount of land that's required. And so basically, the takeaway is that depending on the source of biomass, so switchgrass or miscanthus from the UK or from Louisiana, you will use different amounts of energy. You will use different amounts of land, different amounts of water. You will mostly produce energy, but it can be more or less energy. Sometimes you can be very energy inefficient. So importing willow, for example, which is quite a wet biomass, a high moisture content biomass, you could actually do something in a way that you would not actually be energy positive over the entire supply chain. So you can see 38% or 26%. So this then corresponds to the efficiency of the power plant once you've added the BECCS. So if you take the Willow, so a 26% efficient plant or a 38% efficient plant, this starts to, it's the same in terms of water use and the same in terms of land use, but it means you need a lot more or less BECCS capacity. So in other words, is this widget intended primarily to suck CO2 from the atmosphere and generate a bit of power on the side? That will be this one, the 26% efficient facility. Or is it primarily intended to generate power, and by the way, suck some CO2 from the atmosphere? So that's moving up in this direction. So you can see how there's a linear, obviously, dependence of efficiency of the energy balance on the efficiency, but there's also a linear relationship between the amount of capacity deployed. And what that in turn starts to speak about is the amount of capital, the amount of money, CapEx, that gets tied up in this discussion. And so this in turn then ripples on into how will these projects get financed and what level and what type of revenue stabilization or revenue support they might need. So again, it's complicated. What we then did is start thinking about the way in which BECCS might get deployed in different regions and how different regional aspects might impact overall costs. So in this, we're able to think about costs in three different ways. One is the cost per ton of CO2 stored. Another is the levelized cost of electricity. And then finally, the amount of the cost per ton of CO2 removed. And again, there's a delta there between the cost of doing the storage, the value that you create when you start generating and selling electricity, and that obviously varies market to market. And so, for example, in places where electricity is relatively expensive, that gives the BECCS option an advantage, which isn't obvious unless you're looking at it through these lenses, because if you're getting more money for generating the electricity, then you need less incentive, or you need less margin to pay for the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So all of these things, again, become quite convoluted. Key point, there are significant cost differences across the different regions. And so again, this is starting to point us toward an argument that, well, international and interregional collaboration will be really quite important to do this, to achieve these targets in a least cost way. It obviously introduces the challenge around verification and avoiding double counting and so on. But it starts to at least tell us how important the different things are. And again, this argument is unpacked a bit more in a recent paper in One Earth. We're thinking about direct air capture and how it might deliver negative emissions and where and when and so on. So you're looking at, so we've got a very hard to crack code. So a 2020 energy mix using direct air capture with a solid sorbent type technology, and we've dubbed that DAX-CE. This is how it behaves in terms of its carbon efficiency today. And then a liquid sorbent, a liquid solvent type technology, and we've dubbed that DAX-CW. This again gets implemented in the model. And given the current energy intensity, the carbon intensity of the different energy systems in these different cells in the different parts of China, India, Europe, Brazil, and North America, the United States, it tells you how good they are at removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The takeaway, if you're in a country that is primarily built on coal-based electricity, running an energy-intensive process for removing CO2 from the atmosphere doesn't actually deliver much in the way of CO2 removal. However, by the time that we get to 2050, based on what the IPCC projections tell us about the evolution of electricity systems, they become much more effective. So in some senses, this is just telling you, stating the obvious, you need low carbon electricity as a prerequisite to start deploying energy intensive approaches for the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Rules of afforestation. So again, some basic ideas of how, so this is basically how we went about implementing afforestation in the model. So we start off with a parcel of land that is not forested, and the idea is you've got land, you break it up into stands, you want to develop those stands in a sort of sequential basis, so you'll have a resource out of which you can continuously harvest biomass and thus continuously remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So this starts out with an establishment phase, and so on until we get into a mature or full vigor phase. And throughout this phase, you need to maintain that forest. So this isn't sort of plant trees and walk away. This is actively manage this land. So what that then means is that there is a flux of CO2 in and out of that forest system from both anthropogenic or from human interventions to maintain the forest potentially, but also as the forest transitions from its full vigor and mature phases into its old growth phase. What this then means in terms of the greenhouse gas balance, so basically the rate at which CO2 is being removed from the atmosphere. So on a per hectare basis over time, you can see that different regions will perform better or worse on a per hectare basis at removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. This sort of jaggedness to the line, this reflects the intervention, so that the thinning operations and so on to maintain that carbon stock, which need to go on for some time. What is useful to know is that regardless of sort of context, I think by about 40 or 50 years, you've reached this kind of turning point where you've stopped removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So this hectare in, say, Brazil, it's saturated with carbon more or less. And what you're now doing here and going on for some time is maintaining that carbon stock. And of course, that comes at some cost. So for example, this hectare, you'll have been paid X amount of money. We know recently that Microsoft went out and purchased about 1.3 million tons of CO2 removals or offsets from the market. They paid on average $20 per ton for that. And it was mostly afforestation. So the argument is that for $20 per ton, and we now have something like, call it 500 tons for that hectare, you've been paid 20 times 500 for this. And now, going back to the point at the beginning of the webinar, we need to start thinking about maintaining that carbon store for a very, very long time, which is not going to come for free. In that context, it's important to note as well, so all forests are not created equally. And by that I mean, if you're starting from, say, where the UK is, so we had some time ago, and we'd reached a kind of a max level of deforestation. So we'd reduced UK forest cover down to about 5%. Since then, it's been brought up to about 12%. So 12% of the country is covered in forest, more or less. But those forests are still quite, they're quite fragmented. Okay, so they're not, it's not 12% in one big forest. It's lots of little forests, which in aggregate come to about 12% of land cover. That's one place. If you're, say, in southern United States, and I'll get onto that in a second, where you have tens of millions of hectares of forest, that have been managed and under maintenance for now, for several decades, 70 years or something like that. The way in which those forest assets may participate in greenhouse gas removal initiatives can vary quite significantly. And so the role and value of forests in that context, I think it will vary significantly by national context and will likely evolve with time. So planting a tree is not planting a tree, not everywhere. If you think about where we are in the US South, so again, this is a number on the y-axis, but the x-axis is going on time. So we can see with this green line, there have been a sort of 82 to 84.2 over the course of the last 70 odd years. 82, 84 million hectares of land that's been continuously covered by forest for that period. In that period, they've gone from 5.2 to 10.8, so just over doubling the standing inventory. So they've slightly more than doubled the amount of biomass in that land. So same amount of land, double the amount of biomass. So that's a win. They have also significantly increased the annual harvest, so the amount the rate at which biomass can be produced from that land. Obviously, that's not being produced to do BECCS with or anything like that. That's for pulp and paper and timber for construction and so on. But the point is that with a given amount of land, we can both increase the amount of standing, we can both increase the standing carbon stock and also significantly increase the productivity of that land. So, and the point here is that then afforestation and building and conserving land carbon stocks is not necessarily in tension with delivering a sustainable supply of biomass which can be used for greenhouse gas removal in other contexts. There may be a tension between the use of the biomass, so you can use it to produce energy to provide energy services, or you could use that biomass in wood for construction, for example. And again, there will be a best case argument to be made there. So what's the cost? So this is a slightly mischievous slide. What's the cost of afforestation over the absurdly long term? So you can see that, looking at the cost per ton from afforestation, according to through the lens of our model, which is not perfect, but covers most of the key steps, I think. And this goes out to 10,000 years. You can't really see all of the kind of jaggedness because it rolls into itself. But the sort of the takeaway is that these are large numbers on the y-axis relative to the sort of $20 a ton number that people are familiar with in the context of the sale of voluntary offsets and so on today. So if we're thinking about providing a permanent transfer of carbon liability. So I emit some CO2 from into the atmosphere today, and I'm going to pay Olivia, because I can see her on the screen, $20 to permanently take ownership of that liability and hold it in a forest carbon stock. And I've managed to get her to do that for $20. I've made a killing if you're going to do this for 10,000 years. That's, I've got a really good deal there, because, that's a challenging thing. Now, of course, that's absurd, because in the year, 12,021, I don't think we'll probably be having this discussion, and contracts just simply aren't going to be enforceable, and no one would want to even have that on a balance sheet, and so on and so forth. So I suspect something other than permanent liability of, in this way will have to be arrived at as we're thinking more maturely about the role of these technologies in delivering carbon removal services or pathways. So again, I'm not going to read through this, but basically, and then there's a very live conversation now about the way in which countries will rely upon greenhouse gas removal credits that might be purchased from other countries. So in one extreme, every country has to do everything by themselves always. At another extreme, we're going to trade everything and rely on everything. Where this could take you is different countries recognizing the efficacy of different greenhouse gas removal pathways in at different levels. So something akin to an exchange rate. So that's one thing that this might bring us toward, or something else. But the way in which different countries will engage with each other, I think, is really important. So what we're looking at here is 3 models, basically full collaboration, partial collaboration, no collaboration. Well, hopefully this works. So this is the total collaboration option. The colors correspond to the amount of CO2 removal per cell. The curve will talk about the way in which we see biomass being traded between different regions. And then the colors in the pie charts. So yellow is BECCS, bluish is DACS, direct air capture, and green is afforestation. So if I let this run, you can see how things start off, and we see the different piece moving. Lots happening in all over the world. Very active trade in biomass, stuff going from the US into China, Brazil to China, Brazil to the UK, to the EU, and so on. So very active, strong preponderance here through the lens of this model with these costs and so on BECCS and afforestation in different parts of the world. When you start reducing collaboration, things change, but not massively. But the problem is that we have a removal target that we needed to get to, 254 gigatons over that period, and what we were able to get to. So as soon as you start imposing friction on the way in which countries can operate, targets start to be put in jeopardy. So this is more or less important, depending on your point of view, but friction maybe isn't all that helpful. And then finally, when we have no collaboration, so every country has to just do everything themselves, oops, every country has to do everything themselves. And this is how we see things evolve. You start to see a more diverse portfolio. So we see a more important role for direct air capture and so on coming in. Through the lens of this model, and this may or may not, I mean, this is almost certainly not true, but it's the evidence that we had at the time. Limited geological sequestration potential in Brazil and India, and as a consequence, they rely heavily on afforestation. China, they have a strong geological sequestration potential, cheap sources of biomass, they go heavily for BECCS, and then the US and EU go for a more balanced or more diverse portfolio at least. Key point here, again, targets missed. So the sort of the conclusion then is that collaboration becomes really important. If we then think about the way in which the countries might interact, so if we have the full collaboration model where we get to remove lots of CO2 for, at a least cost, and then we start removing players from the game. So if you take Brazil and India out, if you take China out, if you go fully no collaboration, this starts to impact the amount of CO2 we can remove and at the cost. So, and it also then starts to tell you the role of some of the different players. So again, this becomes quite interesting. Thinking about the way in which biomass might be traded across the different scenarios, it matters a lot. So if we start thinking about, the full collaboration world, we see quite healthy trades between different parts of the world. India going to and from Brazil and so on. And then this starts to get changed until we get to a sort of do-it-yourself world. The key takeaway here is that right now there's a reasonable global trade of biomass. In a full collaboration world, this could be expected to significantly increase. And if we add friction to that, that would put that in peril. I feel like I've said this before already, but basically the way in which we allow collaboration around the world, it will impact the amount of CO2 that we can remove subject to just the biogeophysical constraints of individual countries. It will impact the cost and it will impact the technology portfolio that gets deployed. So some conclusions. So, the burden sharing piece, I think it's going to be really important to think about how we do that, and almost certainly to be difficult and controversial, perhaps, but important. I feel I'm pretty convinced that mitigation is something that will, can be done on a national basis. So the UK can take decisions, Germany can take decisions, India can take decisions by themselves. But, if we want to try and do removals, I think it's an inherently international challenge. We will need a full portfolio, more than what we've reflected in the modeling work here today. Policy decisions will really influence technology development and the extent of GGR and also costs. I think that the composition of GGR portfolios will vary significantly around the world and will likely evolve with time. As another sort of mischievous comment, so we hear a lot about the sort of moral hazard arguments around greenhouse gas removals. I personally think that this is likely to be a kind of a red herring, and it arises from a mispricing of removals and from a confusion of taxonomy. So with that, I'd like to stop, and Phil, back to you.
Thanks, Niall. That was fantastic. Really nice presentation. I've re-engaged the ability for you to unmute yourself and to put questions in the chat. So I encourage anyone who wants to ask a question can either flick their webcam on and just yeah. Oh, mind us first. So go for a mind.
Hey Niall. This sounds like really very interesting work, because it really leads into kind of policy options that we have, right, as a world. And I'm not sure if you are the one I should ask this, but it's something that I've been wondering myself, and I don't really have an answer to it. So maybe you could give a go. It's obvious that we will need a lot of biomass, and that biomass is going to be kind of engineered or production biomass, if we are to address climate change and carbon mitigation. Do you have any idea on how we can combine that with not making the very plain and straightforward pine forests that you might see for normal production biomass, but a more biodiverse whole that also adds other services and increases biodiversity.
Yeah, so this is an important question, and it's something that I understand people are actively considering in a policy context. So a lot of what people are calling revenue stacking in this context. So there'll be X amount of payment perhaps for the creation of forests. There'll be a certain amount for example, biodiversity support, water maintenance, and so on. So you might incentivize all of these different things in a different way. Not all actors will want to participate. So again, going back to the you have to maintain your forest for 10,000 years kind of absurd argument, what you're basically doing is perhaps suggesting to farmers that they need to take their land out of agricultural use. We're going to stop using that for producing food forever, and we'll just turn it into a forest. And that will obviously have an implication on both income and value of land. So not everybody will want to participate in GGR pieces. So yeah, good question. It's something that people are actively considering, and the instrument that I'm familiar with is revenue stacking.
Thanks, Maynard. So we have a question from Sean. You put your webcam on, so do you want to just ask the question directly?
Yes, Niall, thank you ever so much. Lovely presentation. Enjoyed it very much. Got a question. It was an earlier slide. I think it was on BECS, which showed between now and 2050. It was the one with 100% and then minus 100%. And I didn't quite follow the colours, I have to say, on the 2050. I know you had a lot to cover.
Was it this?
No, it was earlier on. It was a map where you had the colours of different nations, and I want to say there was a scale. It was all blue on the 2050, according to.
Maybe this one.
It was a lovely map, a global map that you had.
This one.
It had a scale of it was something like that between now and 2050.
So, say stop when.
Dear me. There we go. This will be it. Can you explain the right hand side? It's all blue.
It basically just says by 2050, we expect most of the world to be pretty much decarbonized or significantly decarbonized in terms of their power system, their energy systems. And so by then we can happily use that energy to operate a direct air capture facility. So
the carbon dioxide resource efficiency is minus 100%. I just didn't.
Yeah, it just says that this is the amount of CO2 that you're pulling out of the atmosphere. The number that you want to focus on is the percentage in red. So per ton per ton stored, this percentage, according to the model, is removed from the atmosphere.
Oh, okay. I just didn't follow the other scales, which was minus 100%. That was all.
That's to do with the color. It's just a color map. Blue is good, red is bad.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Teresa, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Neil. Thanks for that. Yes, you're completely right. It's complicated, and being fairly new to this area, I can see a big horrendogram coming on. But anyway, my question was about friction. Obviously, to get where we want to be, there has to be total international collaboration. And where do you see that at the moment in terms of collaboration? Is there a lot of friction already? I suspect there is. And also in your map, and I might have missed why these areas are blank before, Africa and the USSR or Russia are all blank. So can you explain that? Or I might have missed that bit.
No, it's a good question. So why it's blank? Because I'm lazy and there's not that much time. We just took USA, Brazil, India, China, and Europe as model countries for the model, archetypal countries, representative countries. Yeah, you could absolutely spend a lot of time filling in lots of other parts of the world. In order to do that, you need access to a lot of data, and you need to be quite convinced of the adequacy of those data, and you need quite a lot of time and energy. So just for those reasons, we haven't done that. In terms of friction, I mean, no comment. I think that, you know, this is something that people are beginning to think about and trying to think about the way in which different pathways will get deployed in different contexts. You know, I think that the cheeky answer is look at how frictionless the supply of vaccines is in the context of our current predicament, and you can build from there.
So are you hopeful or not?
No comment. I'm an optimist, so I'm sure we'll you know, get together and figure it all out.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. I've got a few hands on my list in the order of David, Stefano, Abdullah, and then Duncan. I realize that we've only got about 8 minutes left, so if you could, you know, keep.
Yeah, so I am going to have to jump pretty promptly at the hour. So
okay, well, we promised to get you away before the hour. I think if folks can keep their questions short, and Niall, if you can keep your answers terse, then we might be able to get through it. But I think if we don't, then we can probably answer it offline if you're okay with that, Niall.
Yep, totally fine.
Okay, so we'll go with David first, and then Stefano.
Thank you. A very pleasing presentation. Thank you very much. Just going to any map showing pellets traveling across the Atlantic, after working on this for some time, the thought just comes in your mind, well, it's money going in the other direction then, yes? And that money has to cover the transport charge. Now, surely a better deal would be for the money to go in the opposite direction and have the BECCS plants where the trees are. And if that is true, that would also be true for enhanced weathering, wouldn't it?
So you're right that there is an interesting discussion here around balance of payments, and one way to, so you know, the way that we've done this is the way that we've solved the problem in the context of this presentation is typically with a meet a target for a least cost. You could equally flip that around and say meet a target for max value per country, for example, and that would give you a different argument and so on. So yeah, good question, good point.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Stefano?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Could you add a little bit more on the uncertainty in the storage potential, CO2 storage potential, and the cost of this storage? There is a slide, so I wonder if because I know there is a lot of theoretical potential, but the practical potential is much lower.
Yeah, I mean, so very quickly, we dug through as many resources as we possibly could to find well-approved storage and understand the cost there. But I mean, the takeaway is that your point is spot on, making sure that we have good confidence in the availability and accessibility of CO2 storage resources around the world is key.
Thanks, Stefano. Abdullah?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Niall. My question was for Brazil and India, we see that it's mostly afforestation, which is generally effective for about 40 years. So what do we plan for post that? Do we plan to have it in a cyclical manner, or how could these countries develop into other forms of carbon capture?
Yeah, so the first thing is that, you know, personally, I don't believe, you know, I would not suggest for a second that Brazil and India do not actually have geological sequestration capacity. All I'm saying here is that with the assessment that we did, it wasn't clear that it was there and that it was proven, so we didn't include it. So this is a very conservative approach. Given the amount of coal that India has, for example, it almost certainly has it. In the context of afforestation, if you did want to do it, I mean, yeah, you could find yourself in the place of needing to maintain forest carbon stocks for a very long time, which, as I've sort of indicated, would probably come at a significant cost.
Thanks, Abdullah. And Duncan, I think we've got time to squeeze your question in.
Thanks. I'll try and be brief, but thanks, Niall, for a really interesting presentation, particularly highlighting the variability across specs. Unsurprisingly, I'd like you to unpack a little your final throwaway remark about moral hazard, which is not a helpful term anyway, but mitigation deterrence, perhaps, whether you think mitigation deterrence is also a red herring from mispricing and taxonomy confusion. And if so, what we should be doing about that, given that the start of your talk, you highlighted the taxonomy confusion amongst many people about CCU. And at the very end, you've mentioned the frictions and difficulties of smooth cooperation around COVID, which...
Yeah, so again, really good question. Very simply, yes, don't have time to get into it now, but if you put a right price on removals, so for example, just playing with that $4,000 or whatever it is that you get with maintaining a forest carbon stock for a very long time, that would take it away from the cheap thing to do, and therefore mitigation will become an economically preferable option. That's one way of looking at it, but not by a long way the final way. So.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being very terse with your questions, and Niall being very succinct with his answers. I really appreciate it. I think there's one more question from James, but I suggest we take that offline, and maybe Niall, if you can answer it, we can add it as a chat onto the, or a comment onto the YouTube video.
For sure. More than happy to take emails or anything like that from anyone. I mean, Duncan, I'm mostly looking at you. More than happy to talk about this offline as well. So thank you all.
Yeah, so just once again, I'd like to thank Niall for his excellent talk, and just to remind everyone that the next presentation will be in 2 weeks' time on the 14th of April, and that will be Nem Vaughan talking about the project Fab GGR, which is again looking at similar questions around afforestation and biomass energy with CCS. I do encourage you to look at our website, register for that, and come along to it. But otherwise, thank you all for turning up. And with this video, we'll post this video on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again at your leisure. But again, thanks all for coming, and I'll see you around soon.